So in 1965, Christine Van Acker was 17 years old, driving with her mother.
You have two girls out on a lonely, dark road at night. Some beast comes out of the field, probably out of the woods too, and encounters them. So the windows are rolled down. There was a storm impending that day. Very hot, humid Michigan, steamy summer, with light flashes in the background, in the horizon. And now you got a beast that comes into the full view of the headlight beam.
Dark, hairy, 7 foot tall. By the drawing I've seen, it looks kind of a classic Bigfoot shape, not much of a neck.
And what is the first thing that this inexperienced young girl does? She panics and she screams. And she locks up the brakes, the car slides, and it stalls. And now the beast is at the window, and they're both screaming.
And a creature jumped out, and it seems like I've heard two stories, like it jumped onto the hood or just jumped in front of the car. They stopped. The creature, the Bigfoot, I don't think they were calling it that then, but the monster came out, grabbed her head and banged it against the windshield.
She screams, Mama screams next to her. They're all screaming. The beast screams. Christine, the driver, the 17-year-old driver of the car, she faints. At some point, it was claimed that the beast got the hands entangled in the hair, in the jostling and stuff. The little girl slammed her face against the doorpost, injuring the eye.
I've had experiences 10 miles north of there. Trees being knocked over, not being able to see what was doing it. This was in the middle of the winter on a little island in the Huron River, and I still couldn't see the tree or what was pushing it over. Yeah, I was really early in the subject, so I was just going out whooping and rock clacking and wood knocking, and that day I got a response. There was a park bench, and I set the rocks on either side of the park bench, kind of underneath, so every time I'd go to that park, I'd grab them, and so that day I got a response. In the middle of the winter, no one else was there. I think it was the day where not even the park maintenance, because they'd be right behind me on a bar. So here's a bike trail, park maintenance behind me, buildings, and the Huron River, and some little woods in between, but not much. And
In 2013, me and my son were camped out at the Skamania County campground on his spring break. First people in and only people in the campground, and we found a vine maple that was limb twist broke, an 18 by 9 inch impression in the ground. We found other branches snapped off of fir trees 12 feet up. And that night, and we thought, oh, cool, didn't think. My kid was like, oh, Bigfoot. I'm like, well, you never know. And that night we actually had something came in and grabbed our tent and pulled on it not once, but twice. And it's a long story, but my kid slept through most of it. I was up all night. I couldn't get out of my tent. I had my hand cannon on my chest the whole night, and an adult man, and I can't get out of the tent because I'm so scared. And I could hear whatever was in the campground. There's at least two moving back and forth around the camp. I think they were just messing with us. But around 4 a.m, pow! It was like a rock on a tree, knock. Everything went quiet. I got out of the tent and built up a fire and waited for my kid to get up. After that, that's when I decided to start doing stuff like this.
There are a variety of contrasting behaviors reported in conjunction with potential Sasquatch encounters. While not all, or perhaps any, can be considered proof that Bigfoot exists, they are noted regularly enough to be considered of importance. Often occurring in proximity to both singular encounters and areas with numerous reports, they have come to be thought by many researchers as hallmarks indicating one of the creatures may be nearby. Any one of these actions might, on their own, be easily debunked or ignored, but when put in conjunction with another, they begin to construct an image of how a creature like Sasquatch may potentially live.
There's definitely a difference and when you look at behavioral patterns, there's definitely a difference. You could find aggression at sometimes. It's a difficult question because it depends. You know, I've heard so many different encounters and I've talked to so many different people. There's some things that really stand out that you've seen. You know, they've seen a figure in the distance, right? Or it seemed friendly, and they didn't seem like it was aggressive or there was any concern. They didn't have any fear, no feeling of dread or anything like that. But then there's some times where they're being pelted with rocks, where they feel like they're paralleled, where they're being targeted, and then they get to their house and then something's happening at their house. I've heard that a couple times too. So I haven't looked at different seasons or times of year to make those connections yet, but that's a great question.
Out-of-place vocal tones, usually distinctly primate in nature, are regularly heard and even recorded by both Sasquatch researchers and unsuspecting civilians. There are a number of recorded instances where vocal tones that can't be matched to any absolute subject are considered as potential Sasquatch evidence. Some of them, such as the Sierra sounds captured by Ron Moorhead and the Ohio howl recorded by Matt Moneymaker, are referenced frequently in research circles.
What kind of like audio signatures are you looking for when you're going back through? Because you told me you've analyzed like thousands of hours of recording. So what are you looking for when you went through all that?
I'm usually, because when I first started, I had to really learn all the other animals too. So I listened while I looked, but most of the target subject vocalizations, they fall in a certain hertz range, and a lot of times they'll look similar to human vocalizations, and so I look at a narrow hertz range, and when I see something that doesn't match up with the known animals, then I stop and I look at it, because I look at it visually just like David does. And it's something over time. I've been doing it since 2015. It's 2021 now. The first year, everything was new, and now over time I can look at an audio file in 5 minutes and know if there's something different there or not.
I've had multiple friends at work, talk about different situations. It seems like, anybody that spends any time in the woods around here has an experience, at least one that they talk about. People that, you never would have thought, and you mentioned that now that I do the investigating and they know that I do that, some people come forward and be like, oh yeah, I have something that happened to me that I never told anybody about. I had a friend who was out parking with a girl and had two red eyes that he caught staring at him from in the trees that just disappeared. I had a friend that was a hunter that he's very much a skeptic, but he says that he was in an area, and it's all on Chestnut Ridge, just different parts of it. He had a real guttural scream on a super cold day that there was no other sound. You know, it was one of those dead quiet in the woods he was hunting, and this guttural scream, and he goes, I have no idea. I've never heard anything like that in all my years hunting.
Well, it's communication, but the question is what? Why are you communicating? What is the importance? Is it, where's my partners? Where is everybody? Kind of a long vocalization to, gibberish, speech-like sounds that would, maybe that's talking. Maybe so. It's a communication structure that we are trying to help identify. A grouping. That's not people. You could understand what people are saying, even if it's in a different language. You can identify the language, but I've got a lot of gibberish stuff that you can't tell what the heck they're saying.
Strongly indicating a reticence to be seen at all, many Sasquatch encounters describe a creature lurking behind trees or other effective forms of cover. Witnesses describe a swaying back and forth motion, wherein Bigfoot is seen peeking out from behind an obstruction. Still other encounters feature the subject stalking or following human beings, sometimes for miles.
I had a very possible sighting in 1986 in Big Bear, California. We live down in the city, so my youngest brother was having a birthday, so we decided to go on a ski weekend up to Big Bear. It was February. We got up there, it was booked. My dad couldn't find a place to stay. We're driving around for a few hours. We finally found this cabin at like 1 in the morning. It's snowing, so we're all excited. Let's go play in the snow. We go behind the cabin, there's a road. We start making snowballs and we're throwing them at each other and just being kids. I was 14 years old. And somebody noticed something, or someone was standing on the road under the streetlight over there watching us play. And we were just like, what the hell? So I knew all about Bigfoot, and I was a pretty smart ass kid. So I'm like, hey, if you're a human, say something. That thing just stood there. I'm like, hey, are you a man? What? Hey, I'm like yelling at this thing, and it just stood there watching us. Didn't move, didn't make any sounds. And we kind of got freaked out and just ran back in the cabin. And I'm like, hey, we saw Bigfoot kind of thing. And a friend of mine from high school, a guy I used to race motocross with, his dad used to be a researcher in the 70s and 80s all over Southern California, and he'd go up to Bluff Creek, and he was really into it. He has a lot of cool stuff. And my friend wanted me to tell his dad that story, and he actually had a lot of action, a lot of reports in that area in the mid-80s. And I've talked to other researchers about it. There's only two things it could have been: a human or a Squatch. There's no mistaking it. So I just think the chances of it being human is just astronomical. I mean, why would someone be standing on the road at 1:30 in the morning in the snow watching us play? Where'd he come from? Out of the woods? I mean,
In areas where Sasquatch is believed to actively inhabit, witnesses and researchers will note oddly broken trees or limbs. This presents a strange juxtaposition against natural tree fall. Of course, trees will bend and break on their own accord due to wind, freezing temperatures, fungal infestations, and other natural occurrences. However, instances where healthy trees are bent or broken by an unidentified source, sometimes even to the extent that branches seem to be intricately woven together, lead many to assume that this is an atypical Sasquatch behavior, particularly if this area has a history of activity.
We were out at, actually near my house. There was couple of them are in a tent, and then there's a percussive.
Oh, wow.
Watch. Oh, no. Watch this. Oh, listen. That was a tree right behind us.
That was very loud.
Oh, it was huge.
It just kept going. It just.
Yeah, and then we hear it moving around. Pretty sure something knocked the tree over towards us.
What's the craziest thing that's happened to you since you've been involved with the Olympic project out in the field?
Well, we had a crazy night in August down in central Washington. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of whoops and knocks and other vocalizations, and we hiked down in this camp at 9:30 at night that I actually was creeped out in the camp in the daytime, and I told them I didn't want to go down there, but we ended up going down there, 6 of us.
We start getting ready for bed. We're all in our sleeping bags, and all of a sudden the chatter of us starting to die down to go to bed is broken by this tree fall. That changed the game because it went from just, okay, we're gonna just be out here camping to, oh my goodness, there's no wind. It's possible that this could be natural, but this is probably an angry Sasquatch. So yeah, that got us all riled.
When that tree fell, I thought, oh God, here we go, it's on. Because we knew they were in the area, but I took that as a sign of aggression, like it wants us to get out of there, and it's getting pretty pissed. That night, that one or other individuals would not leave us alone. They're just walking around camp all night long. And one of our members actually saw it walk through our camp.
Wood knocking and rock clacking are loud percussive bursts heard echoing through wooded areas. While some examples of such audio evidence are generally ambiguous as they can be attributed to the natural noises of the forest, others are far more striking and difficult to explain.
And one other incident too, I was thinking, we were doing an investigation down in the southern Chestnut Ridge by Uniontown, and we had a real loud guttural scream in the middle of that, and then we had a wood knock that was just like real forceful, 3 of them real quick together. And it's always been, what I've noticed in being out there, it always seems like when the wood knocks happen, everything quiets down after that. So I don't know if that's some kind of a warning or something, but it always felt that way, you know, to me. Like every time we do wood knocks, things quiet down. So. And then another thing, just in some of our investigating, now we had a rock clacking incident very close to where we were last night. That we were just out and just doing a little bit of clacking 2 rocks together, and I had something answer me, clack for clack, for probably 5 minutes, and no reason for anything to be out there. And this was in the middle of the day. We were just hiking on a hiking trail, and just were messing around a little bit. And as soon as I did it, it would clack back, and it answered me every time. And that went on, like I say, about 5 minutes.
But probably the most compelling piece of evidence for me is some personal experiences I've had that I've recorded. Specifically, I've had a power knock go off within 40 feet of me in pitch black dark in the wintertime in the middle of nowhere. And I don't know what else is going to do that. I know bears and elk don't do it, and it was just me and 2 other people. There were no other humans around. And yeah, that right there is probably the most compelling for me, audio-wise. But, you know, just it's accumulation of a lot of stuff. I got so many different vocalizations now, and more than I ever expected to catch, which is just because I'm out in the woods all the time.
Rock throwing, unlike howls and knock-like noises, are much more difficult to debunk. Most animals are not capable of throwing stones at human beings, and when the rocks in question are excessively large, sometimes even described as boulders, the list of potential culprits grows extremely short.
My personal encounters that I feel were aggressive were the rock throwing. And I've had the playful rocks thrown at me, which were like little pebbles, to rocks that were as big as the palm of my hand, coming close to taking my head off. And when they were thrown, they ricocheted off the trees by me very forcefully and somewhat concerning to me. If they'd have hit me, I believe it could have hurt me or killed me. They didn't want me there. I don't know why they threw rocks at me. I've had rocks thrown at me in so many different locations. Maybe because, like I say, I don't have any fear. Maybe they sense I don't have any fear of them and I'm a threat to them. I don't know, because I don't run away. I don't get afraid and hide from them. I stand my ground, and all of a sudden rocks come blistering through the woods and almost take out my head. I've heard stories where people, there was one couple that allegedly were up on Laurel Ridge. I think that was 2008 or 9. I can't remember exactly because I didn't investigate it, but some of the other PBS members did. At the trailhead, they allegedly had been up there parking, and they claimed that Bigfoot attacked their car and ripped the driver's door off of the car. Now, they again disappeared. After we tried to contact them and see the car and go to the location and recreate the activity, they never would respond back to our messages. So did that happen? I don't know. I mean, I've read reports, as anyone else can online. There's several reports where people say they aggressively been charged, bluff charged, attacked, hit, all sort of things. I personally have never had anything but the rocks. And I felt intimidated by the rocks. I mean, I'll be honest with you, when something's throwing rocks and they're bouncing off of trees from below, coming up harder than I can throw the rock going down, it'll get your attention really fast.
A common intimidation tactic in many animals, bluff charging is meant to frighten away a potential threat by giving the appearance of being the prelude to an attack. However, bluff charging is not followed by any actual violence. Sasquatch are often said to bluff charge at witnesses in the wake of an encounter. Again, these bluffs do not end with the witness being attacked, at least not in any case where a person has survived to tell the tale. All of these actions have the propensity to be particularly frightening given that we don't know exactly what any of them mean. This brings us to the question which may be at the heart of the entire Sasquatch search. What is the purpose, the meaning of these various behaviors? If we knew that, of course, the search may very well have been concluded already.
Well, I had an experience when I was 17 years old, way back in the 1900s, if that tells you how old I am, back in 1999, that was very consistent with, I understand now to be consistent with what other people attribute to the Sasquatch phenomenon. To make a long story short, myself and 4 friends heard very intimidating sounds at night that included like branches breaking. You could hear branches being ripped from trees and struck against trees. These vocalization sounds like whoops or moaning howls. A tree being snapped and pushed over close by us, like heavy movement on either side of us. But at the time had no explanation for it because we knew we weren't dealing with people, human aggressors. And we knew they certainly didn't behave like deer or bears or anything like that. So it's just this unusual, anomalous experience that didn't have an explanation for. And then eventually, a couple of years later, I stumbled on Sasquatch information online, which at first I thought was just preposterous. Like, I literally remember laughing as I was reading. It was actually a few bits that were written by Dr. Hinner Fehrenbach, this sort of like FAQs that were on the BFRO's website. And it was a bit about like behavior and, you know, hurling stones in this big arc and tossing around oil barrels and having this generally terrible odor. And it was just laughable to me, this image, you know, because in my mind, I'm like transmuting that into some cartoon monster, you know. And then started reading about people's experiences that were eerily similar to what we experienced. And then it became, you know, a pretty gripping question of like, well, could that have been what we encountered? Could that be, you know, what we experienced?
When we're talking about differences in Sasquatch behavior, trying to profile actions that might be aggressive versus things that might be more passive, we do see kind of a concentration in certain geographic areas. In Alaska, there are indigenous stories that describe them as being cannibals, as being very dangerous. And if we go all the way back to China, as far back as the Zhou dynasty, which is hundreds of years ago, you have stories of Sasquatch-like creatures, the Yeren, or the Chinese Bigfoot, it's sometimes called, which are described as kidnapping women and children. There are certain places where you have older stories where these things are described as aggressive or unfriendly. But when we're talking about the modern reports, looking at modern databases, there doesn't seem to be a specific pattern. You have some sightings that we think of as being very aggressive, and you have others that we think of as being very passive. But as to what's creating those situations, what's causing those reports to manifest in the way they do, I don't know that there's any conclusive answer to that, at least at this point. We do tend to see, at least in most places, that sightings spike during the times of the year that people are outdoors, which makes sense. But as far as what time of the year, what location, what climate, if that makes them more aggressive, less aggressive, you do hear quite a few stories coming out of Florida, the skunk ape, sometimes Louisiana, the Honey Island area, where those creatures are sometimes described as more aggressive. And the theory is sometimes that, well, it's a hairy creature living in a swampy human environment. Of course it's going to be aggressive, but there doesn't seem to be a consistent pattern.
Behaviors like rock throwing, howling, and tree breaking may sound aggressive on the surface, but rarely are reports found wherein a Sasquatch or similar being is said to actually attack someone. As a contrast, there are many, many documented Bigfoot encounters which are decidedly not aggressive, and in some cases, even peaceful. For example, respected Sasquatch researcher Chris Noel, currently headquartered in Vermont, has studied a plethora of Sasquatch reports and sighting locations around the country, including long-term habituation sites.
I didn't know you could do anything to kind of systematically study this species until 2005, when I started hearing about the BFRO expeditions, and that you could actually sign up and pay a modest amount of money and go around with people who had had experiences with the species, interactions, and also knew how to elicit responses from a local group late at night. Through talking to these people and connecting online, which was just beginning to be more efficient and feasible at that time, where there were chat rooms and such, I connected with people who were living at what became called habituation sites, where the local Sasquatch group and the people living in a house on a property became less and less fearful of each other, less and less instinctively recoiling from each other, which is usually the default position before familiarity is built up. And that's the notion of habituation, like Jane Goodall and her chimpanzees and Diane Fossey and the gorillas. There's this familiarity that gets built up over years where both sides realize that you're not going to hurt them, that the other side isn't a danger, a threat. And so there can be more relaxation. Of course, even at habituation sites, people hardly ever see Sasquatch in the daytime. It's almost always at night, peeking from behind a tree or
going from point A to point B in the moonlight so you can see them, but they're as much shadow-like as they are substantial. Every now and then, people at these sites, and the main woman I started visiting in Texas would see them in the daytime, and it was just remarkable.
The varying situations and circumstances which make up any Sasquatch encounter may be an important clue when it comes to separating varying behaviors. Do we encounter Sasquatch when we stray into its territory, or when it ventures too close to ours? Are they more interested in watching, perhaps even studying us, or are they simply trying to stay away? A perceived invasion of Sasquatch territory on the part of humans may account for some more seemingly aggressive behaviors, such as rock throwing and bluff charging. By the same token, perhaps curious, passive actions indicate an animal that is exploring or venturing outside of its comfort zone. A scarcity of food may evoke aggression in any animal, normally peaceful or otherwise, and a perceived threat to a juvenile or family group may also prompt less than friendly behavior. But in situations where witnesses report events such as gift exchanges or leaving various foods out for the creatures to find, the interactions seem to present a stark contrast to cases like that of Christine Van Acker's encounter from 1965.
Well, what brought me out here originally was a sighting report of a man and his wife that had a fairly aggressive encounter where they walked off trail and something started screaming at them. And the guy had been coming up here for years and never heard anything like that. It was a bit of an outdoorsman. And as they retreated from where they were, going back to the trail and then back out to the road area, he could see something moving, off to the corner of his eye, basically escorting them out. And to me, that was very aggressive, very indicative that they may have interfered with a territorial type of area.
It can be really difficult to know what to infer when we're trying to discern aggressive versus non-aggressive behavior because there's so much about Sasquatch that we don't actually know. We might interpret certain things as being very aggressive, but really it might be something that's just completely outside the scope of what we understand.
I think sometimes the creature might be startled by an encounter. For instance, when Cliff Sparks rolled up on the creature back in 1975 in his golf cart, I think he startled it. And so Cliff got to see the creature too that was focused on the dog in the cart and not on him. So he got to see this unique vision. So you have that characteristic of the red glowing, almost laser-like eyes. That's not always reported in other reports. So I think if the creature is startled, it might act differently. I also think it may use defensive mechanisms. For instance, a large, voluminous cry or shriek might be more of a protective thing, that it's able to generate this noise to startle whatever is the danger for the creature. So I think it's probably determines whether the creature feels it's in danger, or if the creature feels it's safe, or if it's going to be a gentle encounter, or it may exhibit these different ranges of emotions. And I think it's all probably in a protective vein.
I was with an organization back in 2006 where, a couple of the guys had pine cones thrown at them. We've gotten vocalizations, rock clacks, wood knocks. Just an amazing area here. Rock clacks are where a couple of rocks may be, slapped together. Can't explain necessarily why or what's going on, or even if it's Sasquatch doing it, but it's very odd. One would think to do rock clacks, you would have to have hands. So either, maybe a raccoon is, but I can't explain it. But there's been reports that I've read through time that sometimes, besides wood knocking, rock clacking is also associated. Now, why they do that, I have no idea.
From what I've noticed in the Sasquatch topic, there does seem to be some sort of differences between regions and climates and seasons especially. I'll give a couple examples. Here in the Northeast, in New Hampshire and New England, a lot of the activity seems to be quite seasonal. We're talking sightings and activity in usually the late summer and into the early fall. That's kind of when a lot of the sightings tend to happen. Now that could be because it's before winter, logically that would sort of make sense. Regionally, it would make sense too that there'd be differences in behavior because you're talking about different environments. So if we're talking about the southern Appalachians, which is a very rich biodiverse area, Georgia, North Carolina, some of these areas would differ than even the northern Appalachians, where we have many more months of winter and different food sources. Then compare, mountainous regions like the Appalachians to the swamps of the deep south. Or then you go to the Pacific Northwest, the temperate rainforest. You've got coastal areas, so there might be coastal food sources. So all these different habitats have different biodiversity and different things that any creature, Sasquatch or otherwise, would have to interact with and basically utilize while in its environment and kind of existing with it.
Well, my personal one would be last week, the incident that happened to myself and another member of Massachusetts, which I'll delve into more, but in a nutshell, we went out camping. Actually, it was last Monday. Set up camp, pretty uneventful Monday night. The next night we went out, just sitting at the pond, brought our chairs down. I brought a drum and a couple little noisemakers, and just joking with my friend, he whistled, and I goes, "Oh, it's an old folklore I've heard. You shouldn't whistle in the woods. You could attract something." And maybe 20 minutes later, I did a couple beats on my drum. Then I just sat, and we heard a huge splash across the pond, maybe 120 yards. We measured it the next day. We went back, and it sounded like a person jumping into the water. That's how loud and kerplunk, big giant splash. We've heard beaver tails slap the water. Now, a lot of people are still saying you heard beavers, but there's no way it was a beaver. That's the first thing I thought. What kind of got me on edge, because before that, it was pretty uneventful. It seemed like another night of just sitting out in nature and going back to camp later. But then, an hour later, this happened, and we kind of left in a hurry. I know I did. My friend was kind of composed a little more, but I literally, jumped out of my chair and grabbed my chair at the same time and just tossed it. And it's a pretty heavy chair. And that was probably my most interesting in Western Mass. And then, like I said, this was just last week. Well, that was the first splash. To finish it, before I did leave, it was probably 5 minutes in between the big splash, and I was whispering to my friend Mike. I said, "Hey, if we get a rock tossed in any closer, I'm leaving, because I'm not up for it. That's close enough for me." And I don't care what anyone says. "Oh, why'd you run? Why'd you run?" You get rocks tossed at you, you tend to change your mind. And within, like I said, about 5 minutes, I said that, and within 2 minutes, I said, if something comes closer, I think I psyched myself into starting the fear from the first splash. So a few minutes later, when I said that, I goes, if one comes closer, I didn't think that close, because it came from behind us. And this one was straight across the pond. And this one we were 20 feet to the water, and that was 10 feet from the shore. So we were 30 feet from this next splash. And like I said, that's the one when enough, I'm out of here. We're leaving. I yelled out, we're leaving. It was that close. That's probably the most impactful incident that's happened to me as far as up close, and I don't really need to get much closer. I would like to see it. I've never seen it, but it was pretty intense for me.
Three well-documented examples: Christine Van Acker's violent and traumatic encounter, Christopher Noel's body of research, and Dave McCullough's somewhat ambiguous, though no less frightening, run-in, present three potential patterns of behavior: aggressive and confrontational, curious and shy, and perhaps somewhere in the middle. Many Bigfoot encounters can be described just this way, somewhere between an aggressive confrontation and a frightened or curious response to human presence. But where is the line between an aggressive versus non-aggressive encounter? And how well equipped are human observers to make this distinction? It may be that behaviors we perceive as aggressive are simply being witnessed out of context, with observers lacking a full picture of what motivations are in play. At the same time, the inverse may also be true. Actions which we judge as curious or playful may have ulterior motives, creating the potential for misconception or even potential danger. Whatever the case, when people find themselves unexpectedly in the path of a massive or even mythical creature, such as what happened to Christine, the results can be frightening and, in some cases, leave a long-lasting impact.
Most of the ones that we get are road crossings or things of that nature, the kind of mundane, benign encounters. We've had a couple where the animal's seen a more aggressive approaching houses, or more of a curious nature looking in windows, or spying on girls having a sleepover. That happened in 2010, I believe it was. We've gotten some reports like that, but most of them are just chance encounters, someone hiking or camping or driving, and one crosses the road or one's seen in the tree line. There is one case that maybe Stan could speak towards if you do talk to him again, that I found a little more aggressive than others, and I just recalled this one. It happened on Mudpike Road in 2016, May of 2016, where two guys were driving down the road about 11 o'clock at night, and it was raining. And that road is very windy, very steep, and there's not much guardrail protection on the right because it drops down pretty deep into the forest. So they're driving slow, and in the distance, I'd say maybe 50 to 100 yards ahead, they watched something dark and brown cross the road in front of their vehicle, and they assumed it was a bear because it happened so fast, and it didn't seem like it was upright. But they continued down the road, and as they did, this upright thing came down off the embankment, walked into the roadway, and stopped. And it didn't continue down the roadway or down the ravine, it just stopped. So the guys in the car stopped, and they're looking at this thing with the high beams, and they're wondering, okay, what is this thing? What do we do? Do we back up, turn around and get out of here? Do we approach it? Well, they sat there and they had a stare off between this thing for several minutes, and eventually they decided to back up, and they figured this thing would continue on its way, they could continue down the mountain and go home. Well, as they backed up, this thing stood there and it didn't move, it just looked at them. They thought, well, maybe if we drive towards it, we'll spook it and it'll continue on its way. So they did the same thing as they did backing up, except going forward, and they drove almost right up on top of this thing, and they told the investigator they were literally bumper to creature. They hit this thing with their bumper. And that's when this thing turned, looked down, put its hands on the hood, and was glaring down in the windshield at them. And it stood in that position for several seconds, kind of like, you hit me, now you're gonna pay for it. And it was just kind of a stare off. They sat there freaked out. Now, if I remember correctly, there was a gun in the glove box, and they went to get the gun. That's when this thing stood up and turned and walked down the hill. That's the first time I've ever heard something like that happen up here, where actually the Bigfoot seemed so sure of itself that it stopped in the middle of the road and it confronted these guys, and even there was physical contact on the hood of their car. A side note to that, the next day, I went up with other investigators to check out the case. We found the area where we believe that the creatures came down off the embankment and crossed the road. We didn't see any place where they entered the road on the opposite side, but we found some very large slide marks that came down the embankment. So we investigated that. We came back up that night, and while we were there, we saw strange lights in the forest. And they were witnessed by 5 or 6 of the investigators. And that was literally 100 yards from where the sighting actually took place. So there we go with those weird lights again.
So many times in these reports, we get a conical shaped head, or what was described in one encounter as otter type head. And what that may be is a phenomena Dr. Cook had talked about, which is called piloerection. And that's when you get the goosebumps and the hair follicles stand up, and it makes you feel, or it makes you appear a little bit larger or a little bit, on edge. So it's that if the creature is startled, that those goosebumps and hairs may form more of a conical shaped head. And so in 1975, Cliff Sparks described the creature he saw as having a conical shaped or cone shaped head. And he actually startled the creature, or feels he startled the creature. So that may be why it was that shape. Now the same thing happened in 2019 on June 2nd when a witness saw this creature, and he said it stood up and was startled because it had seen him. It had apparently been laying down taking what he thought was probably a nap or something. And so as it was walking away, he noticed what he described as the otter-shaped head. And of course that would be also described as conical. So that may be one of the reasons, is this this effect called piloerection.
But it never was a direct relationship, you know. It never got to the point where you could sit down together and try to converse, or, you know. So I started talking a lot to this woman in East Texas, and then I went down there several times and obtained some pretty good thermal footage that I call the woodpile Sasquatch footage, because it's crouching down, looking at us through a opening in this pile of lumber about 35 feet away from where we were, in front of a bonfire. And we were just roasting marshmallows and hot dogs, and every now and then I would go outside of the firelight and scan the tree line with my thermal camera. And I saw in the little viewfinder, I saw a horizontal like bar of light, and I thought, you know, I was looking for something enormous and upright, you know, and I saw a bar of light just right a little bit off the ground, and I thought, this must be a rock that retained the heat from the day, or like a bar of metal or some kind of metal. But it wasn't until I got back to Vermont that I looked at and saw that it was moving, and that it was going like this, flicking its hand, and cupping the end of this pointy board. And I realized it was a Sasquatch arm, because it was huge. And then I upped the contrast and saw two big round eyes. In thermal, the eyes are much hotter than the rest of the face and the head. So these two eyes were just like jumping out at the viewer through this hole.
It's kind of hard to describe. So I think sometimes you talk to folks and you get a feeling, this person's a good person, right? They got a good heart, right? And when I talk to those folks, and those are the folks giving me their experiences or their encounters, they seem to be always friendly, right? There's not an opportunity, there's no fear, right? And then I talk to somebody who's a hunter, who may have been armed, or you know, something from that perspective. You could tell that they don't seem like they have the best of heart, and then next thing you know, they're going on with their experience, and it becomes something that is not very nice.
The problem is that we don't know what motivates, what upsets, what makes Sasquatch happy. We just don't have any idea. So we might interpret something like rock throwing or howling as being very aggressive. You know, stones are being thrown at us. So we might take that as, we need to get out of here. We need to get back to our own space. But if you look at, again, the folklore, the historic background of this stuff, there is a story that comes from the First Nations of the West Bank in Canada, where if you meet Sasquatch in the woods, or the creature that we would think of as being Sasquatch, you're supposed to offer it some kind of a rock as like a peace offering, I guess. And it's supposed to be a rock that has some kind of significance to you. So not to say that's a one-to-one to the modern reports of rock throwing, but again, we might interpret this one way when there might be an entirely different way of thinking about it. If we adapt to some of these alternative perspectives, if we look at indigenous beliefs and the history and the background, there might be another way of going about that. But at the end of the day, we still don't actually know. Until we find one of these things, until we can look at it biologically and say, okay, this is what motivates it, this is what it likes and doesn't like, we don't have the one-to-one that we have with known animals. We can look at a bear doing a thing and say, okay, we know why bears do that. We don't have that in the Sasquatch world.
So in my opinion, when we see reports that have a more aggressive nature versus a more passive nature, is some sort of territorial aspect. I at least think so. Some of the cases I'm personally aware of horror stories like the property in Alaska, Area A, where there was construction being done there in a habitat, and sort of what you could interpret as aggressive behavior is taking place, rocks being thrown, vocalizations, that sort of stuff. Maybe that's just a sign of aggression of, hey, back off my area. We don't know. I mean, I don't know what other interaction that would kind of fit into. That sort of makes sense to me. More passive behavior seems to be perhaps either curiosity or coincidence. Some of my favorite eyewitness encounters and stories were people that were not expecting it. You know, somebody was going to do a trash run on their job in a state forest that they were working in, such as John Wilkes' encounter. He happened to come across these creatures, and they were just sort of, one was picking up trash and it ran off, and there was another one that let out sort of an aggressive vocal that scared him, and that was maybe just a, hey, get out of here or leave the young one alone. There's other reports, you know, a lot of the passive ones tend to be, oh, it was just across the road in front of me, or there was, I saw it through the binoculars as I was looking for birds. You know, we were out hunting in a certain area and something happened. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think just it's situational. I think a lot of the behavior is situational. You encounter many animals or wildlife. It can depend on what you're doing. Maybe there's, you know, you're making food or you're creating some sort of something that would attract an animal. I mean, we've heard stories of Sasquatches allegedly stealing people's fish when they're fishing, and deer when they're hunting, and hogs and that sort of stuff. There could be an opportunistic angle there, at least from what we know with some of the anecdotal kind of eyewitness stories. But overall, I think, again, I'm just going to reiterate, I think, again, most of the behavior, hold on, I'm stepping over myself. I think most behavior that's reported tends to depend on the situation, you know, what's going on. If it's ongoing activity, like a place like Area A or Snellgrove Lake or some other sort of area where there's like an ongoing human presence in a very remote area, maybe there is some sort of territorial thing going on there, more aggressive than perhaps just passive. Obviously, we don't know until we really are able to prove something. It's all speculative, but just given the behaviors and the things we're talking about, they seem to be pretty consistent and they're reported. You know, Ape Canyon, if we are to believe the story of the miners, that was done as a sort of aggressive response to being shot at, or you know, there was a curiosity factor with if the cabin was actually there. When the cabin was built, there seemed to be encounters with these creatures and the miners started shooting at them. And if we're to believe that story, maybe that tells us that they were curious, you know, what are people doing in this really hard to reach place? And then it turned into aggressive behavior. So that was, I think, situational again. So
perhaps if we knew what emotions, motivations, or biological necessities are indicated by Bigfoot's behavior, we would be that much closer to discovering the true nature of the creature itself. Are instances of thrown rocks, warnings or threats, or simply a cautious way of saying hello? Do the whoops and howls many report hearing indicate a language or communication system, or are they simply the bestial cries of a primitive animal? And what about instances of Sasquatch following or stalking people? Is the creature merely curious, or does this particular habit indicate a more nefarious intent? We can answer these questions fairly conclusively when speaking about bears, large cats, deer, or any other number of large, scientifically identified species. But when the subject of the question is one so ill-defined in the scientific lexicon that it is considered by the majority to be a hoax, we are left with more questions, often more than we started with, when attempting to identify the motivations of a Sasquatch.
Really, my whole conception of them is that they're so far from being the monsters that many people think, like marauding through the woods. They're extraordinarily controlled and careful. That's the main theme of their interaction with us is control and having the upper hand tactically, you know, and in terms of terrain management and line of sight. They are just geniuses compared to us. And I don't think they're ever going to be a protected species because A, they don't need to be. They've been hitting it out of the park with respect to avoiding being murdered by us. That even when the first one does get shot or run over by a truck, which is inevitable, I don't think that there's going to be a second one for a long time. You know, the woods will be flooded with would-be trophy hunters, but Sasquatch is just too good at what they do. And I think that the first person to either kill one and haul it in before the floodlights and the scientific, you know, this dissection slab will be rich and famous. But the second person who does that, I hope, will go to jail, because interveningly there will be legislation making it tantamount to murder to bring one of these things down. But I don't think in the end it's going to be an endangered species, A, because you can never do a count, because they're so elusive. I think, you know, I think that Jeff Meldrum thinks that there are 5,000, or did at one point, 5,000 in all of North America. I think there's more than that in Vermont, because I just happen to live here, and within 12 miles of here, I've been in contact with 3 different groups. And this is just a random spot in northern Vermont. You know, so I think extrapolating from that, anywhere where there's forest, undeveloped forest, and plenty of water and food and game and roots and berries and leaves and wood, I think they eat wood, there's going to be a thriving population. People see young ones all the time. I think they're not having any fertility problems, that, as far as we can tell. And, you know, there's more forested acreage in America now than there was in 1950, by far. We have 750 million undeveloped acres in the United States, and in Canada there are over 1 billion undeveloped acres.
No, I think that, you know, I've talked to a lot of folks. I have a lot of friends that have a lot of opinions, right? And the more and more I talk to folks, the more I believe truly in what they're saying when I hear them say, and I have a really good friend who has done, he lives his life in Bigfoot research. And if you have an open mind and a good heart, you're more likely to see a Bigfoot, and you're more likely to be on their good side.
Until the day that Sasquatch is finally officially found, we may not be able to discern what the disparate patterns of activity and reported Bigfoot behaviors indicate. We can guess and even draw reasonable conclusions by referencing the behavior of known animals. But concrete answers and provable conclusions remain presently off the table. Is the creature that injured Christine Van Acker in 1965 of the same species that Christopher Noel has spent years studying? And where does Dave McCullough's encounter, and others like it, fit into the overall picture? Perhaps the day will come when answers are found to all of these questions, but that day has yet to arrive. With that in mind, those seeking to chase after the elusive wood ape might do well to keep their wits about them, and their eyes and ears keenly on the lookout for potential patterns of aggression.
It was just a darkness, you know, a giant dark figure, you know, and then that's what I mean. I wish she could be hypnotized or something, because she, you know, the smell, she heard it hit the front windshield, which is called the A pillar, you know, where the windshield is held together on each side. That's an A pillar. This is the B pillar. It hit there, you know, and then her head's slamming against the thing because it went in and got caught in her hair. But no, she didn't. I think, you know, think about your peripheral. This thing is grabbing you, trying to put myself in my mom's position. I think she did see something, you know what I mean? But either way, just the hearing it and the smell, and then having her hand touch its top of its hand, paw, whatever, and getting those injuries, those porcupine kind of injuries. She doesn't explain that she got like a great look, like at its face or its teeth, or, you know, a lot of stories you hear that, like it had a broken tooth and it was snarling and they were all yellow and it smelled like crap, and, you know, all that stuff. But everything you could think of, from people teasing her. And she was, I believe she was starting to be a hairdresser at the time. And hairdressers talk, you know how it does. You get your hair cut, they want to know all about your kids, about everything. Every haircut, you know, it's got, you know, it just becomes, it's not just, it's bringing up the trauma constantly. You know, it might be fun to talk about for a second, but then something hits. You know, you can see it in her eyes, like something hits, like she remembers that smell, that hand, that thing. You know, all these people, they see one. Even this latest guy, he saw it how many ever feet away, you know, and it scared him, and how many other ones dropped out of the trees or whatever happened. And look how traumatized just that 12-year-old kid is. I mean, there's very, very few stories even of being kidnapped by Bigfoots. And, you know, I read a story, I don't even know if it's true, you guys might have heard of it. Guy, I think it was in the 80s. Guy's sleeping in his sleeping bag, wakes up, one's dragging him through the woods in his sleeping bag. He shows up, the story is he ends up in a Bigfoot nest with a whole family of them. Little fat ones, big tall ones, women, boobs hanging out, all this stuff. He stays there, I don't know how long, 7 days or something. He finally gets some kind of trust and escapes or something like that. There's a story on it. I don't know if that's that's a creepypasta, that's a real thing, you know, but there's very few where they actually come in contact, you know. And like I said, my mom, she really thinks that it hit the car. You know, it really wasn't trying to get to her. It was just like, I mean, even when you like use the most of your imagination and try to imagine, you're like this creature or whatever, and like we're aliens, like basically. And you know, what do we do when we see a spaceship? I would run up and touch it. You know what I mean? Definitely. I know not to touch an alien maybe because there's probably radiation and stuff like that. I always thought you'd tackle it and, you know what I mean? Show me where Bigfoot is. I'm gonna prove my mom right. You know what I mean? But